Well, welcome to the lecture presentation on the history of the Baltimore County Bar Association. My inclination when I start talking about a history of a topic is usually to go to bricks and mortar, and that I guess comes from my land use and development background, and I tend to remember when buildings were built and who built them and why they were built. But with the Bar Association, and this Bar Association in particular, so much depends upon the individual characters as opposed to the character of the individuals, but the individual characters that form this association and that have been a part of it for these 90 years. Originally, and I've still come to this conclusion, the Bar Association was formed in 1920. In 1920, May of 1920, about 22 individuals came together to form the Bar Association. Prior to that time, there had always been sort of a loose association of members of the bar who practiced in the county. We know that because they would give presents to one another on occasions, subscribe to, when someone got married, they'd subscribe to a silver service or do something like that. And indeed, that tradition continued up into the 1950s when the Bar Association, I guess, had so many members that it had to start putting a dollar limit on the presents that it gave out to members for weddings and children's births and things like that. But we know there was an informal association, and these gentlemen were real characters. Put yourself back, and I was sort of looking at this as an exercise. You know, we're now talking of people to die off from World War II, the greatest generation. And we go back to World War II and we look at that and we go, gee, 1945 to 2011, you know, that was a long time ago. Well, go back now to 1920 and 1865. We're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War this year. In fact, yesterday, I guess, was the day they fired on Fort Sumter. Well, by 1920, that was only 55 years after the Civil War. You still had members of the bar who had participated in the Civil War, one side or the other. You certainly had children during the Civil War who had grown up. That's the era that we're sort of talking about. And you sort of have to put yourself back into that sort of rough and tumble type of era to realize the conglomeration of men, and it was men only in those days, that put together the association. You had members of leading families in Maryland. And when I was looking at the names of the roster of the executive committee of the Bar Association back in the day, you had, in addition to Lawrence Enzer, you had J. Fletcher Gorsuch. Fletcher Gorsuch was the Gorsuch family out in Baldwin, Maryland. He was noted primarily because when he became judge, after he was elected judge, he committed suicide immediately thereafter. But he was a very prominent member of a very prominent family, was a very eminent member of the Bar Association. You had William Lawrence, who later became a judge in Baltimore County, in Hartford County, who was a member. You had Redmond Stewart, who founded the Green Spring Hounds and was one of the prominent members of the Green Spring Valley group. His grandson is Jervis Finney. You had James J. Lindsay. James J. Lindsay was a prominent attorney, became a state senator in Baltimore County when Baltimore County only had one state senator. I believe he succeeded John Grayson Turnbull as state senator, and then he came from there to become a judge on the circuit court. These are all prominent men, but you had thrown into that mix Civil War, you know, people who came out of the 1890s, 1880s who weren't from the prominent Maryland families, who all of a sudden had become attorneys. And you could become an attorney in those days, not only by going to law school, but by serving apprenticeships. And so you had a number of attorneys who came through by serving an apprenticeship and passed the bar or became members of the bar after that and could practice. So the association was very concerned in those days about the conduct of law and the conduct of how law would be practiced in the county. At that time, in 1931, there were 3 standing committees. There was a grievance committee, and it was not until relatively recently that Maryland adopted an independent grievance committee. back into the 1970s. Up until that point, grievances against attorneys were handled by the Bar Association. And the bar would basically hear the grievances and then make a decision on whether to recommend expulsion of the member or not. There was a legislative committee which took care of activities of the association with the promotion of desirable legislation. And then there was the Judiciary Committee, which suggests, formulates, and seeks to bring about advantageous changes or modifications in court procedure and other things pertaining to the court. So the Bar Association was formed both to keep a certain standard, if you will, of the calling of the law, and also to protect, let's say, the financial basis of the attorneys practicing law. In Baltimore County, the Bar Association had a reputation for being powerful or prominent. I think, again, because of some of the characters who belonged to it. Lawrence Enzer became state's attorney, Maryland state's attorney, state insurance commissioner. At the 1931 meeting, they attracted William Preston Lane, who was then the Attorney General of the state of Maryland, later became governor of the state of Maryland. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge is named after him. It was built when he was governor. He was noted primarily for raising the sales tax, which then led to his defeat in 1950 by Theodore McKeldin. H. Street Baldwin is again of a Baltimore County family, very prominent family. He had been a two-term congressman during the 1940s. And probably was sort of the patriarch of the Baldwin family, which we know through various judges and other members of the bar. But Baltimore County consistently had leaders in state government coming from it. You had people like O'Connor. Herb O'Connor, who was governor and U.S. senator, probably more from Baltimore City than the county, but was very closely affiliated with Baltimore County. One of the other purposes of the bar was to protect the county attorneys from city attorneys. Because of the affiliation or the closeness of the county to the city and that we surrounded it, and because of the fact so many city attorneys lived in the county, the idea was that the county was supposed to be first, the Bar Association was to be first and foremost to serve those people who lived in Baltimore County, practiced law in Baltimore County, and to make darn sure that those city attorneys kept their nose out of what was going on in Baltimore County. They could be invited to events. The Bar Association was nothing if not cordial and polite, but business was business and sociability was sociability. And I understand, Bob, you had to have an office in Baltimore County. But that actually derived more and more as it went along. By 1931, the Bar Association had 70 members. And there was a limit on the number of members who could become, or people who could become members of the Bar Association. It was capped at about 100. In the first meeting, I have records of it, was the first banquet, the annual banquet that was started, was over at what was known then as the Rogers Forge Golf Club. We now know it as the Country Club of Maryland. If you know the Country Club of Maryland, you know the house that serves as the club headquarters, you can understand why by the time you got to about 70 members of the Bar Association, it was pretty well tapped out if you were going to have a banquet there. And then it was moved over to what was known as the Elk Ridge Kennels, now known as the Elk Ridge Club. And it was there for many years until in the mid-50s it was moved over to the Green Spring Inn as the Bar Association grew in number.